No?
Yep.
My name's Jose, Marín, Jarrín, and I am okay with the Hatfield Marine Science Center recording this talk.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so where did your...
Nice to have a good crowd. It's my pleasure to introduce Jose, Marín Jarrín, today. Many of you know Jose because he did his PhD here and finished up in 2012. And before that, he did a master's with Alan Shanks at U of O on a Fulbright scholarship. And then after he left us, he went to Central Michigan University for a postdoc working on yellow perch and plumes and fish growth and dynamics. And then as part of the Fulbright and his desire to go actually see his family a little bit, he and his wife and children went back to Ecuador, where he was at Espol in Guayaquil for 2 years, working with the university there. And he continues an adjunct employment, but he's been with the Charles Darwin Foundation in the Galapagos for the last year and a half or so. And today we get to hear a bit about what he's been doing out there in the Galapagos.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to start out by apologizing for two things. I always do this, right? But the first thing is my original talk was going to be just about the fisheries program. I had to scrap that because right now I'm working as interim science coordinator, and since it's Hatfield, I had to tell you guys a little bit about the other projects that go on at the foundation, the marine projects. The second thing is that I wrote this on a boat on the way back from Darwin and Wolf, which is about 30 hours back, and so if you see typos, things like that, that's I was probably trying to write it and move this way, that way. It's an issue, but anyway, so I hope you all enjoy it. Okay, so just a very brief outline. I'll start with a little bit of history of the Charles Darwin Foundation. I'll give you a little bit of background on the oceanography, biology, and the zoning of the Marine Reserve. I'll tell you a little bit about the challenges facing the Galapagos Marine Reserve, and then I'll get into the meat, the projects, and marine invasive species, marine turtles, seabirds, seamounts, sharks, and what I think is the coolest one, the fisheries part. And then I'll tell you a little bit about our future challenges, and I'll try to sum everything up. So, as you know, the Charles Darwin Foundation is named after one of its most famous visitors, Charles Darwin, who visited the islands in 1835 on board the Beagle. He toured most of the islands, but didn't do too much. He obviously did a lot, but didn't do too much on the marine side. I think really most of what he did was look at the diet contents of some marine iguanas. He found out that they eat mush, but because of that, the Charles Darwin Research Station was established in the late 50s, early 60s under Belgian law. If you look on the left top side, you can see a building of one of the first buildings ever built. The top right is the welcome sign that is still there. And then the bottom right is a picture I always like. That was taken the day that the station was founded. So it was a joint effort between the Belgium government, Ecuadorian government, UNESCO, and the UN. And what's always interesting to me is that if you notice all the officers, Ecuador wasn't a democracy back then. This was actually a military panel that was running the country at that point. And so that's why you see so many officers in the picture. That's just super interesting to me. Anyways, so the research station mostly started out to help with some breeding programs that we needed. A lot of the more well-known species were the populations were quite low. Particularly the tortoises had a big problem. Pirates, fisheries, invasives like dogs who would eat the smaller turtles, or goats and pigs that would eat their food had a big impact on a lot of the populations. Lonesome George is one of the best examples, the last one in Pinto. So we started the tortoise captive breeding program, which is now in the hands of the national park. We also worked on iguanas similarly in breeding, and that program has also now moved on to the park. Right now we're looking into the pink iguana, which is a species that was recently described in Isabella. for some reason, no one had noticed there's a pink iguana in the middle of the island. And so, yeah, it turns out it's a different species. So anyways, it's the population, I believe, is about 200 adults. So it's a huge issue, and they live around active volcanoes. So it's not a great recipe for survival of the species. So but all of that was mostly terrestrial. In 98 to 2001, the Marine Reserve was created. First 98 created the Marine Reserve, which spans from the imaginary line that joins all the outer islands 40 nautical miles out, so 200 and something thousand miles. And in 2001, we actually zoned the Marine Reserve, meaning that each area can be used for different purposes. And something that you probably already know, it's home to marine iguanas, the only penguin on the tropics. It's also the second smallest in the world, and the flightless cormorants. So despite what it sounds like, the Marine Reserve, we do allow fishing, and that's something that's kind of new for a lot of people, because we think of this pristine environment where no one takes anything. You just go look at animals and then come back. It's actually not quite that way. So I don't know how well this is going to show up. For some reason, there are not many maps of the reserve and the zonation. So here, and I apologize, it's not very clear, but in red, you can see the no-take areas. It's actually very, very little amount of area that's fully protected. The yellow is tourist areas. The rest is open to the fishery. So as you can imagine, the impact, particularly on endemic species, is huge, especially because management and the regulations is quite lax. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. Okay, so why is it unique? Well, I'm not telling you anything new. There's one current coming from the east, the South Equatorial Current, that smashes onto the islands on one side. It has influence from the north, the Panama Current during the wet season, what we call it. So between December, April, really warm, very wet, really humid. Right now, for example. And during the dry season, it has a bigger influence from the Peru Current coming from the south, which is also an upwelling current, wind-driven, very much like here. So it's cold, nutrient-rich water. Then there's the equatorial undercurrent that smashes onto the island from the west side, and so for some reason it's doing that. Okay, so it's coming from the west side, and I apologize, I've tilted the islands a little bit. So that's this arrow here, and it smashes onto the island, and because of the topography, it produces upwelling. So this is, and that upwelled water gets then distributed throughout the islands. This water is upwelled, therefore it's very cold and also very nutrient rich, and that allows for great primary production. So this is an image of chlorophyll concentration, and as you can see on the west side, it's extremely high. And this is also high even during El Niño years. So that is what allows animals such as penguins to exist in the tropics. So that diversity of currents and the variation, the temporal variation, has allowed for the development of different ecoregions. We usually work with 3 ecoregions. The far northern, which is top left side, that's Darwin and Wolf. They're basically 2 rocks in the middle of the ocean. Then you have the central southeastern, which is on your right, and this is further subdivided into northern and central southeastern. And the western, which is on the bottom left, with its sub-region of the Elizabeth, which is basically the Bolivar Canal, where a lot of the production occurs. And this quite large amounts of diversity is what allows for these unique marine communities to coexist, right? You have very different systems, species from very different origins, so Panamic, tropical, Peruvian, and so on. But of course, this means that a lot of people want to come and want to visit, and that has an impact of its own. So this is a chart of the local population and number of visitors that we have on the year on the x-axis. You have number of visitors on the y-axis and number of residents on the left y-axis. I don't know why it's doing that. Sorry. It's giving away all my contracts. And this is a little bit old, but basically what you can see is that since the 60s, we've gone up to 25,000 residents, and we're up to 225,000 visitors a year, which is exponential growth, as you can tell. That's really tough on islands that are not only oceanic, most of the islands don't have running freshwater, for example. So everything has to get imported. There's a little bit of an effort into the development of agriculture and cattle to try to avoid so many things having to be shipped in, but it's quite a lot of work. So for example, recently there was a boat that was on its way from Guayaquil to the Galapagos with a lot of produce and stuff, basically. It was just people's stuff. And it ran aground, and so basically we were without certain things for like a week until the next boat came. So it's quite a strain on the islands. So, yep, you already saw that. And so basically most of that growth is due to people who want to come dive and snorkel. Of course, there's so many things on land, but also in the water. And basically you can rent snorkel or dive gear wherever you are on Santa Cruz especially. And there are tour operators that will take you among the islands. So before you had to go on cruises to be able to see these places. Well, now you can just fly into Santa Cruz and just do a one-day rental or take a one-day cruise, and you can go to see a lot of these places. But of course, all these people comes with an indirect effect, and it's going to keep doing this. And that's the invasive species. So many boats coming in, it means that the possibility for such a thing increases. And it's expensive to manage for invasive species. Now think about it in a developing country, in an island, 2,000 kilometers off of our coast. The other thing that has happened is the number of fishermen on the islands has increased. We went from between 200 and almost 1,200 fishermen in about 20 years. And that happened mostly due to the explosion of the cucumber fishery, which is closed. And basically, the population in terms of fishery has been eliminated. I swear I didn't do this on purpose. And one of the things that occurred was that in 1998, when the Marine Reserve was created, there was a special law which eliminated commercial fishing, and we moved on to the artisanal fishery, just like in the picture you have on the top right. That still has not eliminated some of the problems that we had, such as shark fisheries, but for the most part, that's helped sort of level out that crazy growth. So the fishermen are all required to have a permit, which is called a parma. But if you have the parma, you can fish any of the of the species that are fishable. You're allowed to fish. So any of the finfish, cucumber when it opens, lobsters, and all of the other stuff you can fish. And this, of course, requires to manage such a large number of species. You need a lot of information, and that's where the Charles Darwin Foundation comes in. Our job is to provide knowledge to the managers for the management and conservation of the Galapagos Islands. That's our main objective. And so we, at the present, have 6 large marine programs, marine invasive species. Jim Carlton, who many of you know, collaborates on that one. Seabirds, marine turtles, seamounts, sharks and large pelagics, including rays, and Fisheries Ecology. So just in case you're curious, I put the name of the PI of each project on the top left-hand side, in case you're curious about that person or you want to know a little bit more. So the Marine Invasive Species Program is rather new for us. It started about 2 or 3 years. Mostly they're looking at different potential invasive species by settlement plates and doing different diving trips on mostly the docks and the boats that are moving back and forth between the islands. They've encountered several species they think are invasive, but they're in the process of figuring out genetically what they are. What they do know is that there's Acidia sydneiensis, the sea squirt Acidian, is definitely now present on the islands. It was first recorded about a year ago, and it's native to the Indo-Pacific, probably introduced by one of these boats from Panama. And as you can see, it was recorded in Panama a good 40, 50 years ago. And Inti's job right now is mostly looking at the transmission routes, and she's looking at different options. There is a good amount of connection, both physical and human, between in the eastern tropical Pacific, so Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Ecuador, both because of the topography and because of the movement of people amongst those countries. Climate change is predicted to help some of those invasives, and the currents themselves can aid with some of these invasives. One of the things that she's looking at is plastic debris in the water, and she has found a lot of things, as you have here too, some of which are invasive. So the other one is seabirds. Gustavo works with penguins, flightless cormorants, which it sounds like it's a blast to go on these trips. You have to get in the water and avoid them getting in the water, because the moment the cormorant goes in the water, then you just wave at it goodbye, because there's no way you're catching that animal, right? But it sounds like it's super fun. The people, the park rangers are apparently super good at it. But anyways, it sounds really fun. And the water's a little warmer than here, so. And then we have albatrosses as well. So the albatrosses are mostly in Española, which is on the yellow dots on the bottom side of the graph. The penguins are on the red dots, which are all on the west side of Isabella, and the cormorants on the blue dots on the northern western side of Isabella and Fernandina. And there's a couple of things that Gustavo is looking at. One is the threats. Climate change and El Niño seem to be the big ones. And this is a figure with year on the x-axis, number of individuals on the left y-axis, and precipitation on the right y-axis. And as you can see, for the most part, they're, at least the yellow, the flightless cormorants, which are in the yellow, are increasing. And the only moment it drops is when we have El Niño years. So for example, in 98, we have a bit of a drop. And over here in 82, 83, which was the other big El Niño, you can see the increase in precipitation in both cases, and you have a drop in the population levels. He's also found several gastrointestinal parasites, which seem to be have come from the continent, that are also an issue in sense of the health of many of the individuals. We're also looking at marine turtles. This is Macarena's project, and she does a combination of marker capture experiments, and she mostly works at the beaches where they nest. And this is going to be really interesting once we get to the sharks part. Not good for the turtles, but anyways, interesting from a scientific perspective. And the dots, the red dots, is where the turtles nest. As you can see, they do it on a fair number of islands. And what she does is she marks the females on both of their anterior fins. She uses some information on their morphometric measurements, and she monitors the nest to see the survival rates. And one of the things that she's looking at is the movement, and she's found that there's a good amount of connectivity with the continent, so that Eastern Tropical Pacific corridor, which we call. Some animals appear to move back and forth, migrating. Some are residents, so it looks like there's two different strategies that they're developing, and they're also doing extensive migrations to feed basically into the Pacific Ocean. She's moving towards a little bit to the threats in Galapagos as well, and what she has found is that one of the biggest ones is the interaction with the fisheries. So on the right-hand side, you see a turtle that's been not attached, but entangled with what we call a plantado, which is basically, it's I don't know if you've heard of fish aggregating devices. They're basically large buoys, and this one is not fixed. It's so what happens is that the illegal fishermen will drop these basically large buoys outside of the marine reserve. They know where the currents go, and so the buoy will float through the reserve, attracting fish, and they wait for them on the other side. And they capture all the fish and they take it away. So that's a huge issue because of A, it's a lot of garbage in the water, and B, because we have a lot of entanglements. One of them being the turtles. There's also a good amount of, unfortunately, still some consumption, and disease is an issue too. But with the increase in movement among islands, the other thing that's happening is the interaction with boats. We have a lot of turtles that get hit by boats. And because of the ocean conditions, it's pretty difficult for the person driving the boat to see the turtle. So what she's looking at is different scenarios at which speed might, or reduction of the speed of the boats might help reduce that amount of interaction. So she's actually doing a good amount of work with that, looking to reduce that mortality there. The Seamounts project is also very cool, but very expensive, as you can imagine. It's basically got 2 years, and we don't have money to do any more big dives, but we basically received 2 or 3 very large boats, both from Hui and several other large marine labs that were nice enough to let us join, us meaning them, because I wasn't there at the time, unfortunately. But we have manned submersibles that allow us to go to about 1,000 meters, and then we have some ROV information that went down to about 4,500 meters. And we are working with them in 2 different areas. One is the bathymetry. So most of the archipelago is still not completely mapped. And so on the left side, you can see the satellite-derived bathymetry that we were using in certain areas. And on the right side, the information we got from the multi-beam sonars. The other thing is that when you look in places no one else has seen, you find a lot of new things, like new species. And this is a batfish that we think is a new species. They nicknamed it Paco. I'm not sure why. It sounds fun. So, and his eyes just seem to say Paco. So, anyways, but there's also several new species of shark that they have found, and a lot of this is trying to figure out genetically if they are in fact new species. And working with genetics is quite challenging in the islands. We don't have the capacity to do the analysis, so it has to come out. And to get permits to move genetic material out of the islands is a really big issue. With good reason. There was a lot of misuse of information before, and so now they kind of are very strict on how to move things. But that means 2 to 3 months to move material that would have before taken a week. So anyways, that means results have very much slowed down. So one of the most popular projects is the Sharks and Mantas project, and this is led by Pelayo. And one of the reasons that we look at sharks so much on the Galapagos is because it's one of the last places where they are relatively abundant, and because of the marine reserve and the protection that it gives to sharks throughout the island, the marine reserve. So you're not allowed to fish them anywhere in the marine reserve. They are fairly doing well. I like to say that it's more likely that you go swimming and see a shark than not see a shark in Galapagos. And it doesn't seem to be just the marine reserve. The whole eastern tropical Pacific seems to be a magnet for them. They mostly work with 7 species: hammerheads, Galapagos, blacktips, silkies, or he calls them puppies, because when you're on a boat, they tend to follow you around, waiting for people to drop food overboard. It's pretty fun. White tips, tiger sharks, he doesn't call them puppies, because they're 4 meters long, and then the whale sharks. So most of their research goes on in Darwin and Wolf, which is, as I mentioned, you can see a red dot on the top. It's about 200 miles from the rest of the islands. And Darwin is particularly well known because of the arch. And most of you have probably seen image figures like this. So right next to the arch is actually one of the best spots for sharks. They call it the theater, because you basically just go down about 25 meters, you anchor yourself, and you just watch the hammerheads, 300 of them sometimes, just swim around. So that's why they call it the theaters. And basically, all the cruise ships, they just go, they park, and they take their divers there, because that's where the real big action goes on. And so he uses, I just say that he likes to hug them, but he actually says that he does science. But anyway. So he uses a combination of what they call doves and brubs. Doves are basically two cameras that are attached to a bar, as you can see, and they're placed in a specific angle so that you can not only record what is in the water, but also measure them to within centimeters of the actual measurement. So it's actually quite precise. And that, of course, allows you to get biomass of the amount of large predators that you have in the water. And the brubs are baited remote underwater video, which means that they're not in transects, but they're just actually in some kind of casing. They lower them, they have a bait, they wait 30 minutes, and then they pick the camera up and they do analysis on that. And that has allowed them to publish papers like this, where Blaia likes to say that it's the sharkiest place in the solar system. And anyway, I can't say he's wrong yet. But anyways, what you can see on the x-axis is different locations that are known for a lot of sharks, and the biomass on the y-axis. And you can see Darwin and Wolf, which is on your left side, has by far the highest biomass of sharks in the world. It seems to be a very important migration route for whale sharks. Most of the whale sharks, 90-something%, are all females that appear to be pregnant. He has to use the term appear because a reviewer told him that unless he does like a pregnancy test, he can't actually say they're pregnant. But anyways, they're fairly large females that appear to be pregnant. It's unclear what happens afterwards, where they give birth or anything like that, but they appear to be going through the island. A lot of the information they get is from tagging. This part's really fun. I've been able to go on one of these trips. You literally fish a tiger shark. It fights for a while, and then it gets so tired that you can pull it in, turn it over, and then it's sleepy time, like lobsters. And so then you either put a satellite tag or a pit tag on it, and we have receivers throughout the islands. And in Malpelo and Cocos, which are islands for Colombia and Costa Rica as well. So if they move over to those islands, we can also have an idea of where they're going. You let go of the shark. Most of them are tiger sharks. They're about 4 meters. It's pretty impressive because the boat we go on is 7 meters, so it's over half of the size of the boat. And tiger sharks have immense heads. It's just incredible to see how wide they are, which makes sense because what they eat is pretty big as well. And it's always, I think it's awesome. It's the marks of the tiger shark are very, very vivid. I mean, you can always tell them apart. But that kind of research gives us data like this. So this is satellite tagging results, and you can see that for 4 individuals, they mostly stay within the islands. And this is really good because it means the marine reserve is helping protect them. If they're not leaving, they're not getting fished or anything like that. They're staying safe. Now the question is, why are they staying safe? And it looks like, I don't know if you remember this figure, this is the nesting sites for the turtles. And what you can see that we catch them in the canal. For those of you who have been to the Galapagos, you usually fly into Batra, which is right here, and then you take that little boat across to Santa Cruz. Well, that's where they like to hang out. And it looks like they like to hang out because that's where one of the turtle nesting sites is. So they're basically going around chomping on turtles the whole time, which is, for them, it's like Oreos. I mean, they're just, they're gorging on them. The other thing that they have found is that just like with turtles, just like with invasives, the connection with the mainland is pretty big. So they have found movement with Malpelo and Cocos. Like I mentioned, these are 2 islands of Colombia and Costa Rica, but also some movement towards the Panama part. And mainland Ecuador and La Plata. A lot of mantas appear to be moving over there. It's unclear why, but so there's a pretty strong connection on all the marine side. Okay, so I've got, I think, 10 minutes to tell you about the fisheries part. So the fisheries on the Galapagos, like I mentioned, are only artisanal. So there's about 1,200 officially, more like 400 actually fish. And they focus on fin fishes, about 60 species, so a large number of them. Lobsters, there's 3 species, red, green, and what we call, there's a slipper lobster. Those 3 are actually managed. There's a closure and so on, and a size limit, and you're not allowed to capture females if they have eggs either. There's mollusks, there's a chitin, 1 gastropod, and octopus, sorry, I don't know why I forgot about that name. And cucumber, which is one of the most known for the Galapagos. The cucumber is, like I said, it's pretty much closed year-round now. So in the fisheries program, we focus on about 6 projects. One is the brujo life history. So brujo is a scorpion fish. It's like most scorpion fish, deep water. It seems to be a very long-lived fish. And our job is basically closing the life history. It's to figure out growth, reproduction, age. It seems they're reproducing at age 10 to 11, and we've caught fishes that are about up to 17 years old. So they're getting up there in the age-wise. I stole an idea from here using light traps. So we're placing light traps throughout the islands to study a little bit about the dynamics of the zoo and ichthyoplankton. We put them in Darwin and Wolf. They don't work as well in rocky subtidal, it turns out, because the wave just bashed them around, but they work well enough for 2 or 3 times, then you have to basically replace them. But it's really fun because you get to go in the water and chase sharks while you try to put your traps in. We are looking at the benefit of the no-take reserve, so that those few spaces that are completely prohibited to fish, and their benefit to lobsters. And I'm not going to tell you much more about this except that they're not working in the Galapagos. And the reasons are interesting. It's not because we don't have enough. It's not because they're not big enough. It's not because they're not old enough. It seems mostly just enforcement. The fishermen are not respecting the reserve. And so, therefore, if you're not respecting, they can't actually help you. So we're hoping to submit a paper on that soon. With Jessica, we're looking at the role of mangroves for bacalao and yellow tail snapper. And the juveniles appear to only use mangroves during that period. And then they move on to the rocky reefs that are often just outside of the mangroves. And we're looking at El Niño and its effect on the fisheries. And we just submitted a paper on this. So this is what I'm going to focus on for the last part of my talk. So, as you all know, El Niño is particularly felt in the tropical Eastern Pacific. The theory says that Kelvin waves move warm water from the west to the east. This warm water then affects the sea surface temperature, sea surface height, precipitation, and the thermocline itself. And this, of course, produces a decrease in nutrients and phytoplankton production and a variation of the marine trophic chain. So this is a paper that was published by Vargas et al. In 2006. And what you can see is years on the x-axis. I'm sorry, they're a little small. The sea surface temperature anomaly, on the left y-axis, and the number of penguins on the right-hand side. And I'm going to have to move away from the microphone for a minute. But as you can see, when we have really big spikes in temperature, like here, the 82, 83, El Niño, and 97, 98, you see a decrease in the number of penguins. Same thing has been seen for sea lions and other corals, macroalgae, and things like that. But I guess you got to look at the good in all the bad, right? So one of the reason we're interested is because it's considered a way to evaluate the potential impact of climate change on these systems and figure out how it could impact us in the future. So there's been a little bit of research done on this topic. Francis Nicolaides found that the abundance and length of bacalao increased during the 98 El Niño, and DeFeo et al. Found that the biomass of lobsters and sea cucumbers increased dramatically a little after the last El Niño. So this is a paper published by DeFeo et al., and I apologize. Anyways, But you have year on the x-axis on these two, and sea surface temperature, and then you have the landings of spiny lobster in red and of cucumber in yellow. And what you can see is that right after the 98, 99 El Nino, you have a fairly large spike in the catch. And they looked at temperature on the x-axis over here versus 2-year lag catches. And again, the red triangles are El Nino years. And you can see those tend to have higher catches. So we hypothesized that during El Nino events, the Galapagos artisanal fishery landing composition would change with an increase in the percentage of large benthic predatory fish, like bacalao, like snappers, and things like that. We used catch composition, species richness, and diversity, and length distribution to get an idea of what was happening, and we used both parametric, multivariate, and univariate analysis. So basically, we had someone on the dock from 7:30 to 5 p.m., which is when they're supposed to, the fishermen are supposed to come back and let the park know that they're coming back and show them their catch and things like that. And we asked them where they caught. We know they're probably not telling us the entire truth, but these are the locations that they told us about. So you can see fairly much the whole archipelago is where they're going, including the farthest islets. Back then, those were open. They are not anymore. And so Puerto Ayora is where that red star is, so on the south part of Santa Cruz. And just to give you an idea, we looked at March and April 2013, 14, and 16, and this is satellite data for those 3 years. And what you can see is, just by color, 13, which was a normal year, early green over here because it's colder, a little less green here, completely yellow all over because it was an El Nino year, that was 2016. March and April, we use those years because that's the warm season, the wet season, which is usually when the effects of El Niños are most strongly felt in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. So we worked with 16 benthic or demersal species. We recorded 43, but of those 43, a lot of them were pelagics, tunas, wahoos, I think dolphinfish, but I can't remember, of 7 families. The other ones were benthic species, but were only recorded on 1 occasion, so we decided to leave them out. We didn't work with pelagics because in 2013, there was a pilot study to study the effect of longlining in the reserve. I say study because it's just politics and wanting to catch more fish. But and they don't actually publish anything. They just go out, see if they can catch fish. They catch a lot of sharks, which we already knew, but they want to try it again and again and again. I'm not sure why. But anyway, so they caught because of that, a lot of the fishermen were not capturing the benthic species. And so it wasn't comparable to work with pelagics. The other thing is they were taking, once they used the long lines, they were taking those directly to the continent to see if they could increase their profits by taking them. So we weren't getting all the pelagics that we usually get on the dock. And what we found was most of the catch was brujo, so Pontinus clemensi, which is the scorpion fish I mentioned earlier, P. maculatus, which is an endemic grouper, Microperca olfax, which is the bacalao, like I mentioned, and these percentages, I forgot to mention, are percent of days on which they observed. C. princeps, which is the ocean sunfish, ocean, they call them, I forgot the common name in English. They call him blanquillo, which means ocean whitefish, that's the term. Michelle, my wife, who's Caucasian, went to the first days that we went. She went and she bought a fish, and they called it blanquillo. And she calls me and says, "Is this really blanquillo, or are they just teasing me for being white?" And I'm like, "No, that's really what they call it." But anyway, that's actually a fairly common one. And H. macrophthalmos, which is another type of grouper, was also seen in certain days. So like I mentioned, we used some multivariates to look at it, and what we found, so this is an NMDS plot based on similarity of the catch composition amongst the days that we looked at. So if the dots are closer to each other, the catch was more similar than those that are farther apart. Our stress was fairly low, so we feel pretty confident about our results. And we used Permanova to compare among the three groups, so the 3 years. We found that all 3 years were different, but 2016 was more different than the other two. And you can see 2016 way on this side. So we correlated the axes with different variables, temperature. So we record water temperature on the station since the 60s. And then we looked at MEI, the multivariate El Niño index, and a few other options. And what we found was that the best relationship between axis 1 was with the MEI during March and April, which is not surprising. The axis 2 wasn't related to anything that we tried. And we also did an indicator species analysis. Basically, it looks at the abundance and frequency with which each species appears and produces an index, which allows you to determine what species indicate each group. In this case, we only found indicator species for 2016, which was El Niño year. So H. macrophthalmus, which is one of the ones that we commonly caught, we actually caught it, we found it on every single day in 2016, and Lutanus novem fasciatus, which is another snapper. I think they call it dog snapper. And I was afraid about that. I don't know why this figure looks so weird. Sorry, I actually brought the figure itself, because I was afraid of that. Is that going to work?
Did you leave PowerPoint? That doesn't work.
Oh.
Drag it over. It's like a
Ah, that's. So, like I mentioned, I'm not sure why when it doesn't like it. Yeah, I'm just trying to make it. Anyways, I think that's the best that I'm going to be able to do. So, like I mentioned, we looked at the size distribution of the most common, or the ones that the indicator species analysis suggested were important. And you can see size bins on the x-axis and percentage on the y-axis. We've got Brujo, Camotillo, which is the endemic species that I mentioned, Bacalao, this is the other snapper that grouper that the indicator species analysis suggested. This great eye sea bass, I think is the name, Pintacinus, and Caloditelus princeps, which is the Blanquillo. And in whites, we have 2013, yellows or grays 2014, and blacks 2016. And what we found was that in all cases, the sizes of 2016 were larger than 2013 or 14. And we did use statistics, Pomeroy, Smirnoff test, and in all cases it was significant. Which was, let's see if I can get the. Okay, I'm almost done, I swear. Hey, now I can. So basically, we found was that the catch composition was different in 2016 and the other 2 years, and that with larger individuals during the El Niño year. That pretty much follows what the other two researchers had found. The question is why? Our first hypothesis was that during El Niño years, because phytoplankton and production goes down, there might be more food closer to the coast. So basically, the larger animals or whatever, or the uncommon species are coming closer to the coast, farther up in the water column, and they're more available to the fishery. Sounded great. The problem is that there is no evidence for size depth partitioning in groupers or snappers in Galapagos. Bacalao and snapper have been looked at this, and we haven't found any evidence. Plus, the two species that the indicator species analysis suggested are actually already fairly shallow species, no more than 50 meters in depth. Brujo come from 200 meters in depth. So the fishermen were fishing at that depth in 2013. For some reason, they were showing up in 2016 and not in the 2 previous years. So right now what we're hypothesizing is that water clarity that came with a lower primary production and hunger made the certain individuals change their feeding behavior and attack baits that they would not have attacked in other years. Okay, so I've said a lot. Some of it with poor graphics, and I apologize about that. But basically, to summarize, the Galapagos harbors a unique and diverse number of marine ecosystems with a lot of endemic species. About 20% of all of marine fauna is endemic to the islands. It's considered the best tropical archipelago. However, it is very fragile. We have a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties. We have to work with very limited resources. I like to tell people when they want to come work or volunteer for us that if you can open your email, that's a good day in internet-wise. It gets that difficult sometimes. And that's very hard, obviously, for research and conservation. But the great thing is that there's a lot to do. There's a lot yet to be discovered. Just anytime you go in, there is the potential for something new. The light traps are something that we're very excited about because for some reason no one had done that before. The other thing that has shown up is the potential for connectivity. There are at least 4 to 5 marine reserves in the area. So, like I mentioned, Cocos, which belongs to Costa Rica, Malpelo in Colombia, Coiba and Masperlos for Panama, and we have Machalilla, which has been declared a sanctuary for whales, and it's close to becoming a no-take reserve as well. And we're starting to see a little bit of our impact as well. So now that's showing up. And I don't even use Max. Let's see if I can delete that. Delete. Yeah. So this is something that the people that work with sharks has helped do. It's a new zoning of the marine reserve. So in green, you can now see the no-take reserves. So as you can see, it's expanded dramatically. The creation of the sanctuary on top, the green part, is particularly important. That will protect Darwin and wolf even further than it was before. So basically, no fisherman can pass that line. It's changed a little bit with changes in politicians and everything, but for the most part, the size of that sanctuary is now permanent. So the other difference is that in the past, all the zoning was coastal. So the open waters were basically free for fishermen. But now the polygons that we call also protect the open waters where the seamounts are. Because that's probably where the fishermen were going to catch brujo, for example. So it's really important. So anyways, thank you for sticking in with me. And I'd like to thank you all for for your time. These are some of our collaborators and donors. The foundation works only with donations, so individual donations and grants, so they're really important for what we do. And I'm not sure if I have any time, but I'd love to answer any questions you have.
You mentioned the iguanas. I heard they were starving when there wasn't enough algae, and maybe they're pests, or are they still alive and well?
So the question is, what happens to the iguanas? So during the El Niño years, yes, a lot of the marine macroalgae suffered dramatically. So did the corals. The urchins do great. But they do suffer because the type of algae that they I don't want to say like, but prefer tend to disappear. And so they have to feed on lower quality food. And their numbers tend to go down. Right, but they have rebounded dramatically as of late. So they do pretty well.
Are they on all the islands or just a few? Or?
For the most part on all the islands. And they can move pretty much to any island. I mean, we were just up in Darwin and Wolf, and they're up there as well. To give that, some of you are nodding because you've seen them before. They're everywhere. Yeah, and so for example, the Biomar, which is the Department of Marine Biology at the Darwin, we're right next to a colony. And the males fight each other during mating season, then they do adult things, and then the females lay their eggs and things like that right there. And they don't have enough space. The females will lay their eggs anywhere because there's just not enough space for the number that they have in Santa Cruz. Tourists sometimes are a little tricky. They want to grab them. They forget that it's a protected area. But other than that, they're doing well, and there's no fishery for them, so that's really that's one less impact on them.
Just wondering if you had any data that might indicate condition of the fish during the El Nino years, like length and weight or anything like that.
I'm trying to think. I don't. I'm trying to think if someone else did. There's been a couple of papers. So Matthias Wolf, who's from, I think, University of Bremen, has looked at El Nino years and its effect on fish, but I don't think he looked at weight. He didn't looked at the condition factor. I'm not sure if anyone has looked at it.
I didn't know if that might help you figure out
Sure.
the large and abundant guys or lower conditions.
That's a very good point. No, I don't. We certainly didn't collect. Wait, did we? So the thing is that we use volunteers every year, and so depending on the volunteer, they would collect more or less of the information. So total length for sure, everyone collected in species, but the other thing is that the fisherman is trying to sell the fish. It gets a little tricky. I don't think so. John Whitman out of Brown University did find was that the amount of disease, skin disease on fish tend to increase during El Nino years. That was pretty cool. So he had to move some fish out, which was pretty fun for him to fly with fish. But he was looking into that. But I don't think condition was one of the things he was looking at. Sorry, did you?
So what is the markets for the fish that are taken, especially the sea cucumbers? Is it domestic or is it going somewhere else?
No, so the cucumber is closed, but the market was all on the west. Well, in Asia is what I'm trying to say. And there's some crazy stories of the cucumber fishery, like shanty towns, and it was like the Wild West basically. And the fishermen, they're not very shy about telling the stories, and they'll, like in certain parts of Fernandina, they would set up these shanty towns, and they would bring out alcohol, drugs. And so they would trade in cucumbers. That was how you paid. And so they found all these basically holes. So the mangroves are not in estuaries. So there are no estuaries because there's no fresh water. But they're basically just entrances or bays mostly. And so the mangroves grow on the sides, and in the middle they're basically pots or holes, which are great for viewing turtles and things like that. But they knew that in high tide they could go in with their boats because they're small and shallow. So they would go in there to hide from the park rangers. And so they would boil them back there, and then they would take them out to sell. But the grouper and snapper, the snapper tends to go to the cruise ships and fillets. The grouper, particularly bacalao, is important during Lent. It's part of a traditional dish called fanesca. Really good, really bad for the fish, of course. And that's why we estimate that they're at 10% of their biomass, of their original biomass. They're doing really poorly. Bacalao is on top of that a hermaphrodite, like a lot of other groupers. The largest ones are males, and it takes about 90-something centimeters, it looks like, to get to be male, which is obviously what the fishery is targeting. So they're also long-lived, and so you know the whole story. The tuna and wahoo tend to be exported, and that's where we're working with National Geographic and Pristine Seas, which is a foundation within National Geographic, to provide better options for the sale of the fish. They get paid like $1.50 for a pound of tuna, which is prime fish, and yet they're getting paid pennies basically. So the idea is to help them to export the fish, but to do that we have to increase the quality of the meat that they're exporting. And so and lobster gets exported, and it's also consumed a good amount in hotels, in the cruise ships. All cruises provide lobster. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to, I don't know why, I don't want to say force, but encourage all the hotels and the cruise ships to use local products only. Yeah?
You indicated you have a large invasive species. Do you consider some particularly a nuisance or problem to the ecosystem? Or is anything being done to reduce their population?
So I've talked about this so we have people in the marine and terrestrial side working on introduced species. The marine folks don't like to use the term invasive yet because the definition is different between introduced and invasive. Invasive if they're causing a harm or is the potential to cause a harm. So the marine side, the research hasn't moved along enough to call them invasive. On the terrestrial side, we have a type of blackberry that's very invasive. We have several other species like that. Among the introduced, Caulerpa is one of them. I can't remember what species, but it's one of these green algae that basically you tear off a piece and another plant grows, another individual grows from there, and so on. So that one we know is expanding fairly fast. We don't have any evidence of harm yet on any of our communities. We assume that's going to happen, but we don't have any evidence yet. And this year, the park, one of its main objectives is to actually combat marine invasives. The problem is getting the funding for it, which is always tricky, particularly when oil revenues is a large part of where the funding comes from. I don't know if I answered your question, sorry. I went around a lot. Jessica.
You mentioned the challenges with enforcement when those marine protected areas reserves are smaller. So what's the thinking of enforcement now that they're so much larger?
Yeah. Well, the thought is that because basically the fishermen had the potential to just say, oh, we were just fishing outside of it. If the reserve is bigger, basically you have a bigger buffer. Because the big prizes are closer to the islands. So if you, basically it's a lot more of a risk, basically, for the fishermen to go up there. The other thing that they're looking at is whether tourism might be a deterrence to fishermen. And that, for example, Darwin and Wolf, there's always a boat or a ship, a cruise ship. It's less likely that the fishermen are going to get in there and try to fish because they know someone's going to watch them and call it in. And all the tourist areas, you have to be accompanied by a guide, which they're trained by the park. And so there's a direct connection with the park. So the thought is, A, if they're big enough, the risk for the fishermen to get close to the islands where some of these protected species are is bigger, and therefore they're not going to try to go in there. And the tourism hopefully will help a lot with that. But it is a good point. And we have debated a lot whether it's going to end up being more of a paper reserve than a real enforcement, but yeah. Yeah.
In terms of corruption, I mean, there's a lot of problems with you enforce it, you pay them off, and it's fine, no big deal, or you give them part of the catch. Is that being dealt with somehow, or is it still not really going to go away?
That's a very good question. I feel like I need another cup of coffee for that one. Corruption is an issue not just in Galapagos, but in Ecuador in general, many other countries as well. One of the ways that on the mainland they've been trying to avoid is cameras. Someone's watching, you're less likely to do something that's illegal. That's helped a lot on the mainland. In Galapagos, that's a little more difficult if you're on a dock or something like that. One of the things that they're doing to try to help that is to increase the penalties, for example. If you take bribes or something like that, it used to be the penalty was very laxed. And so that's one of the ways that they're trying to encourage that. It's a really difficult issue. The other thing is that you talk to some of the fishermen and they're like, well, I've got 3 kids. One's in jail, the other one's a drug addict, and the other one is doing so. What do I do? Do I stop catching fish? He's like, if there's a fish, I'm going to try to catch it because I got to feed my family. So that's when trying to provide incentives through other channels, through switching over to tourism, which also has its own challenges, or increasing the amount of money they get for their fish, an option to try to help with the corruption issues. It is an issue. I mean, you hear, like, for example, the Marines are patrolling, and you hear of stories from the fishermen that say, oh, yeah, I just gave him a fish, and he was fine with it. Like, they tell us that the folks will actively ask for the bribe. So it's, unfortunately, I hate to call it part of the culture, but yeah, it's difficult. It's because it's so common.
Any other questions?
Lori.
So the fishermen, you had a picture of looked like an open boat,
Mhm.
being 25, 30 foot long. Is that typical of the?
Yeah, so there are three types of boats. There's 17 to 18 meter long boats, like the one that we took up to Darwin and Wolf, that usually are, you can sleep on them. They've got bunk beds, and they have what they call fibras, which are 7 meters long, which is the more traditional one. And those are the more common ones. What they'll often do is they'll get together, several fishermen, and they'll tie up their fibras onto the bigger boat, and then they'll go farther. So they'll use it as a mothership almost, do their fishing. And we actually do that with our research as well, because the smaller boats can move faster and they can go into the mangroves and whatever. So that's usually how they work. But they're not allowed to have any bigger boats than that, because that would consider commercial. Yes?
To what degree are the people who historically were fishing, have they gotten into the business of being guides or running boats between islands to support the tourism? Is there that kind of economic trade-off so that people don't have, some people can get out of the fishing industry if they choose to?
Yeah, there's been several attempts to try to move them over to the tourism side. There's also the vivencial. When you do it basically it means that you can take tourists out to see how you fish, to teach them how to fish. I can't remember what the term in English is, but it's called pesca vivencial. And so there's several methods that they've tried to move them away from the fishery. The problem is that during the cucumber fishery, the amount of money they were getting was so large that a lot of them think that we could go back to that. And so a lot of people hold on for that. The other problem is that the way the law was written is for every fisherman, all their children were also, once he or she passed away, all their children would also get the permit. And so you had 300, then you had 900. And so we already eliminated that rule, but it's a little late. Now we've got 1,200. And even though 400 only fish, the other ones are waiting for some kind of compensation to give up their permit. So it's, the amount of money, it sounds like it was surreal. I mean, and so that's the problem, is that to get them to go from that, where they didn't work that hard to get the cucumber, to these more, lower paying, but more stable jobs is a little difficult.
So one of the things I found interesting when we visited was that there's no such thing as, there's no charter boats that take tourists out fishing recreationally. Is that's still the case?
Yeah. The artisan, the vivencial, which I mentioned, is the only way that you can actually go out. Yeah.
You can't go fish there.
No, you can't go fish. Yeah, I brought out my fishing rod thinking I might, but no. I said, I'm the PI of the project. No, still not.
I believe Jose's going to head over to beer 195, so if anyone wants to talk to him or just have a beer, that would be nice. So, thank you for coming.
Thank you.